The old alien sat in his chair by the window. His blue scales had faded to a pale gray over the years. His left arm was missing below the elbow, and the stump was covered with a simple cloth wrap. His name was Kethral Vaughn, and he was 147 years old. In Velthary years, that made him ancient. Most of his generation had died long ago, either in the war or from the memories that followed them home. The young journalist sitting across from him was named Tiravine. She was barely 30 years old and had never seen a human in her life. To her generation, humans were just another species in the galaxy. Trading partners, neighbors. But Kethral remembered a time when the word human meant something very different. It meant death. It meant terror. It meant the end of everything the Velthary Dominion believed about itself. Tiravine activated her recording device and placed it on a small table between them. She smiled politely and folded her hands in her lap. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," she said. "The historical archives have very little information about the Earth campaign. Most of the military records were sealed or destroyed." Kethral made a sound that might have been a laugh. It came out dry and bitter. "They were destroyed because our leaders were ashamed," he said. "We went to Earth thinking we would add another world to our empire. We had done it 37 times before. 37 species had fallen to our fleets. Some fought for a few months. Some surrendered in days. None of them lasted more than a year." He turned his head and looked out the window at the purple sky of his homeworld. "The humans lasted 5 years. And in the end, we were the ones who surrendered." Tiravine leaned forward slightly. This was not what the old history book said. The official story was that the Velthary had withdrawn from Earth for strategic reasons. A mutual agreement. A diplomatic resolution. "Can you tell me what really happened?" she asked. Kethral was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I can tell you what I saw, what I lived through. But I warn you, young one, you will not sleep well after hearing these stories. I still don't, and it has been 60 years. He shifted in his chair and began to speak. The Velthary fleet had arrived in the Sol system on a bright morning in Earth's northern hemisphere. There were 120 warships, each one carrying thousands of soldiers. The humans had nothing that could match their firepower. Their fastest ships were slow and clumsy. Their weapons were primitive. Their planetary defenses were laughable. The Velthary commanders had studied Earth for months before the invasion. They knew about the humans' endless wars with each other. They knew about their divided nations, their competing governments, their petty conflicts over resources and territory. The commanders believed this would make the conquest simple. A species that could not unite against itself would never unite against an outside enemy. They were wrong. The first Velthary ships descended over a region called North America. They broadcast a message demanding immediate surrender. The message explained that resistance was pointless. It promised that cooperation would be rewarded with fair treatment. It warned that defiance would be met with overwhelming force. The humans did not respond for almost an hour. The Velthary commanders grew impatient. They prepared to begin bombardment of the major cities. Then a signal came through. It was a video transmission from a small human settlement in a place called Kansas. A human female appeared on the screen. She was middle-aged, with gray streaks in her brown hair and lines around her eyes. Her name was Linda Price, and she was the mayor of a town with fewer than 10,000 people. She looked directly into the camera and spoke. "This is a message to the alien fleet in our sky. I don't know who you are or where you come from. I don't know why you think you can take our world. But I want you to understand something very clearly. You picked the wrong planet." The Velthary commanders laughed at her. A small town leader from an insignificant settlement, speaking for her entire species. It was absurd, but within 6 hours, something happened that the Velthary had never seen before. Every nation on Earth stopped fighting each other. Old enemies put aside their hatred. Countries that had been at war for decades declared immediate ceasefires. Governments that had refused to speak to each other for years opened direct communication lines. The humans called it the Unity Pact. Every major nation on Earth signed it within 24 hours. They agreed to share all military resources. They agreed to coordinate all defensive operations. They agreed that no nation would negotiate separately with the invaders. They would stand together, or they would fall together. Kethro paused and shook his head slowly. "We didn't understand," he said. "We had conquered 37 species. None of them had ever stopped fighting each other long enough to fight us. Their internal divisions always made them weak. We counted on that weakness." He looked at Tiravine with his old, tired eyes. The humans were different. They hated each other, yes. They had fought terrible wars among themselves for thousands of years. But when we came, they looked at us and decided that we were worse. We were the enemy that could make them forget all their other enemies. We unified them in a way that nothing else ever had. Tiravine was writing notes quickly. She had never heard any of this before. What happened next? She asked. Kethral's expression darkened. We landed our troops. We expected the humans to meet us in open battle, where our superior weapons would destroy them easily. Instead, they vanished. They abandoned their cities and fled into the countryside, the mountains, the forests. We occupied empty streets and empty buildings. We declared victory after victory, but we were conquering nothing but dirt and concrete. He rubbed the stump of his missing arm absently. And then, at night, they came back. Not in armies. Not in formations. They came in small groups, 5 or 10 at a time. They struck fast, killed as many of us as they could, and disappeared before we could respond. We called them cowards for refusing to face us directly, but they didn't care what we called them. They only cared about killing us. He fell silent for a moment, lost in memory. "There is one name that still haunts my dreams," he finally said. "A human soldier. A sergeant in their Marine Corps. His name was Danny Ortiz. He was not a general or an admiral. He was not a politician or a leader. He was just a soldier. But by the end of the war, every Velthri on Earth knew his name, and every one of us feared him." Tiravine waited, her recording device capturing every word. "The first time I saw what Ortiz could do," Kethral continued, "I was stationed in a human city called Chicago. That was where I learned that we had made a terrible mistake. That was where I learned what humans really were." He closed his eyes. "Let me tell you about Chicago." Kethral had been a young lieutenant when they assigned him to Chicago. He was 23 years old in Velthri years, which meant he was barely an adult. He had graduated from the military academy with high marks. His instructor said he had a promising future. They sent him to Earth because they believed the war would be over quickly. They wanted him to gain easy experience before moving on to more important assignments. Chicago was supposed to be a simple posting. The Velthri had driven the human military out of the city in the first month of the invasion. They had established a forward base in the downtown area, in the shadows of the tall buildings that the humans had built. The streets were empty. The civilians had fled. Velthri Command declared the city pacified and moved on to other targets. Kethral was given command of a 12-block sector with 200 soldiers under him. His orders were simple. Hold the territory. Maintain security. Report any unusual activity. For the first 3 days, nothing happened. His soldiers patrolled the empty streets. They searched the abandoned buildings. They found nothing but dust and silence. Kethral began to relax. He wrote letters home to his family, telling them that the war was going well and that he would return soon. On the 4th night, the attacks began. The first sign was the disappearance of a patrol. 8 soldiers had gone out to check the perimeter. They never came back. Catherall sent another team to search for them. They found the bodies in an alley, stripped of their weapons and equipment. Their throats had been cut. There was no sign of the attackers. Over the next week, Catherall lost 31 soldiers. They were killed in ones and twos, picked off during patrols, or ambushed in buildings they thought they had secured. The attacks never came from the same direction twice. The humans seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Catherall reported the situation to his superiors. They told him to deal with it. They said a small group of human stragglers was nothing to worry about. They refused to send reinforcements. The humans were not stragglers. Catherall realized this when his soldiers captured a wounded human fighter during a raid on one of their hidden positions. The prisoner was a woman named Maggie Dunn. She was young, maybe 25 years old, with short dark hair and cold eyes. Her uniform identified her as a corporal in the human army. Catherall tried to interrogate her. He asked how many fighters were in her group. He asked where their base was located. He asked who was leading them. Maggie Dunn said nothing. She just stared at him with those cold eyes and smiled. They put her in a holding cell. That night, 3 of Catherall's soldiers were killed by sniper fire. The shots came from a building that his patrols had cleared just hours before. The range was almost 2,000 meters, far beyond what Velthari intelligence said human weapons could achieve. In the morning, they found that Maggie Dunn had escaped from her cell. The guards were dead. The lock had been picked with a piece of wire. Over the next 3 weeks, Maggie Dunn killed 17 Velthari officers. She never fired from the same position twice. She never left any trace that could lead them to her. Catherall's soldiers began to panic. They refused to go near windows. They flinched at every shadow. Catherall requested thermal imaging equipment from command. They sent it. His soldiers used the technology to scan every building in their sector, looking for heat signatures that would reveal human hiding spots. The humans adapted. They covered themselves with mud and sewage from the city's drainage system. The filth masked their body heat. They became invisible again. Catherall ordered his soldiers to seal the tunnel entrances that led into the underground. The humans have been using the subway system and the old sewer networks to move unseen beneath the streets. His engineers worked for 2 days, filling the tunnels with rubble and welding metal plates over the access points. It didn't matter. The humans dug new tunnels. They broke through basement walls. They created passages that connected the buildings above ground. They were like water, flowing around every obstacle and finding new paths forward. By the end of the second month, Catherall's unit had been reduced from 200 soldiers to 31. They had killed perhaps 15 humans in return. Maybe 20. He wasn't sure anymore. The bodies disappeared before they could be counted. The worst part was the fear. Catherall's soldiers stopped sleeping. They jumped at every sound. Some of them began to see humans everywhere, in every shadow and every movement. A few went mad and had to be restrained. Catherall himself could not escape the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he walked through the streets, every time he stood near a window, he felt eyes on him. He knew that somewhere out there, Maggie Dunn was looking at him through her scope. He knew that at any moment, she could end his life with a single bullet. The only reason he was still alive was because she had decided not to kill him yet. He requested orbital bombardment. He begged command to destroy the city from space and end the nightmare. They refused. They said it would be wasteful to use such resources against a small resistance force. They said he was exaggerating the threat. They said he needed to control his fear and do his duty. Catherall stopped reporting the casualties. He stopped reporting anything at all. He just tried to keep his remaining soldiers alive for one more day. Near the end of his assignment in Chicago, a young private came to him with a question. The private was terrified. barely able to speak. He asked Kethral how the humans could fight like this. How could so few people cause so much damage? Kethral thought about the question for a long time. Because we are not fighting a few people, he finally answered. We are fighting all of them. Every human on this planet. The soldiers, the civilians, the old and the young. They have all decided that we are their enemy. And every single one of them is willing to die if it means killing even one of us. He looked at the young private with exhausted eyes. There is no small force. There is no isolated resistance. Every human is the resistance. And they will never stop until we are dead or gone. 3 days later, Kethral was transferred out of Chicago. He was one of 11 survivors from his original unit of 200. He left behind a city that the Velthari had conquered and occupied, but never truly controlled. The humans remained in the shadows, waiting for the next group of soldiers to arrive. Kethral thought Chicago was the worst thing he would ever experience. He was wrong. His next assignment would take him to a place that made Chicago seem like a peaceful dream. It was a mountain range in western North America. The humans called it the Rockies. And that was where he would meet Danny Ortiz for the first time. The Rocky Mountains were supposed to be safe. That was what Kethral's commanders told him when they gave him his new assignment. The Velthari had built a massive supply depot in a valley deep in the mountain range. It was far from the human population centers. The terrain was harsh and difficult to navigate. The weather was brutal, with freezing temperatures and heavy snowfall for most of the year. The commanders believed that no human force could survive in such conditions long enough to threaten the depot. They were confident that the mountains themselves would protect the base. Kethral arrived at the depot in the early winter. He was given command of a defensive section, a promotion that came from surviving Chicago when so many others had died. He tried to feel grateful, but all he felt was tired. The war had only been going on for 6 months, and already he felt like an old man. The depot held enough weapons, ammunition, and supplies to support the entire North American campaign for a year. There were 3,000 Velthari soldiers stationed there. The base had heavy defensive walls, automated weapon systems, and constant air patrols. It seemed like a fortress that nothing could threaten. On his first night at the depot, Kethral stood outside and looked at the mountains rising around him. The peaks were covered in snow, white and silent against the dark sky. The air was thin and cold. His lungs struggled to work properly at this altitude, and his scales could not regulate his body temperature well in the freezing conditions. A senior officer came to stand beside him. The officer had been stationed at the depot for 3 months already. Beautiful, isn't it? The officer said, looking at the mountains. It's cold, Kethral replied. How do you survive here? The officer laughed bitterly. We stay inside. We use heaters and protective gear. We limit our time outdoors. If we follow the protocols, we can function well enough. He paused, and his expression became serious. The humans don't have protocols. They don't use heaters. They walk through this terrain like they were born in it. I've seen them move through blizzards that would kill any of us in minutes. They don't seem to feel the cold at all. Kethral felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There are humans here? He asked. The officer nodded slowly. A small unit. Army Rangers, they call themselves. They've been raiding our supply convoys for 2 months. We've tried to hunt them down, but they know these mountains better than we ever will. They disappear into the snow and the rocks, and we never find them. He looked at Kethral with tired eyes. Their leader is a sergeant named Danny Ortiz. Remember that name. If you're lucky, you'll never meet him. Kethral met Danny Ortiz 3 weeks later. The attack came on a night when the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The wind was howling through the valley, carrying sheets of snow that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The automated sensors were useless in the storm. The patrols had been called back to shelter. The Valkyrie thought they were safe. No one could be outside in such conditions. No one could move, let alone fight. They were wrong. The first sign of the attack was an explosion at the main ammunition storage building. The blast lit up the night like a second sun and sent shockwaves rolling across the base. Before the Valkyrie could react, more explosions followed. The fuel depot, the vehicle maintenance bay, the communications tower. Kethrol grabbed his weapon and ran outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He could barely breathe. His scales began to crack from the frost. Through the swirling snow, he saw them. Dark shapes moving between the buildings, firing precise shots and throwing grenades. There were maybe 20 of them, wrapped in white camouflage that made them almost invisible against the snow. They moved like ghosts. They fought like demons. Kethrol tried to organize a defense, but his soldiers were scattered and confused. The storm made communication impossible. The explosions had destroyed the base's coordination systems. Each group of Valkyrie was fighting alone, unable to see or contact the others. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 43 Valkyrie were dead. A month's worth of ammunition had been destroyed. The fuel depot was burning, and the humans had vanished back into the mountains without losing a single fighter. Kethrol stood in the ruins of the ammunition building as dawn broke over the mountains. His body was shaking from cold and exhaustion. His commanding officer came to stand beside him. "That was Ortiz," the commander said quietly. "He's been doing this for 4 months. Small raids, always at night, always when the weather is worst. He never loses anyone. We never catch him. How is this possible?" Kethrol asked. "How can they survive out there? How can they fight in these conditions?" The commander had no answer. Over the following weeks, the raids continued. The Valkyrie reinforced their defenses. They increased patrols. They brought in more soldiers. None of it mattered. One night, Ortiz's team infiltrated the base again and destroyed the replacement communications equipment that had just arrived. Another night, they poisoned the water supply, forcing the entire garrison to rely on emergency rations for a week. The Valkyrie finally managed to wound and capture one of Ortiz's soldiers during a raid. He was a young private named Kyle Vance, barely 19 years old. He had been shot twice in the chest and once in the leg. By all logic, he should have been dead. They brought him to the medical bay and tried to save his life so they could interrogate him. The Valkyrie doctors worked for hours to repair the damage to his body. When Kyle Vance woke up, Kethrol was waiting for him. "Tell me about your unit," Kethrol said. "Tell me where your base is. Tell me how many of you there are." Kyle Vance looked at him with glassy eyes. Blood was still seeping through his bandages. He should have been terrified. He should have been desperate to save his own life. Instead, he smiled. "My name is Kyle Vance," he said. "Private First Class. Serial number 4-7-2-9-6-1-8-3. Kethrol pressed him harder. He threatened him with pain. He promised him medical treatment if he cooperated. He offered him a chance to survive. Kyle Vance just kept smiling. He repeated his name, his rank, and his serial number. Nothing else done. An hour later, Kyle Vance died from his wounds. He died singing a song in a weak, fading voice. Kethrol did not understand the words, but years later, he learned what the song was. The humans called it their national anthem. It was about a flag that survived a battle and kept flying through the night. Kyle Vance died singing about his flag and smiling at his enemies. Kethrol learned a human word that winter. The word was spite. It meant to do something harmful or unpleasant to someone else, not because you would benefit from it, but simply because you wanted them to suffer. The humans fought with spite. They did not fight to win, because they knew they could not win. They fought to make losing cost of Velthury everything they had. They fought to make sure that every victory came with a price paid in blood and fire and grief. Cathrall was beginning to understand why the Velthury had made a terrible mistake coming to Earth. The High Command was beginning to understand it too. They decided to take a new approach. They would break the humans the way they had broken every other species that resisted. They called it the Decimation Protocol. It had worked on 37 worlds. On Earth, it would prove to be the greatest mistake the Velthury ever made. The Decimation Protocol was simple. For every Velthury soldier killed by human resistance forces, 10 human civilians would be executed publicly. The killings would be broadcast across all communication channels. The message would be clear. Stop fighting or watch your people die. The Velthury High Command believed this would break the humans' will to resist. It had worked on 37 other worlds. When faced with the choice between continued resistance and mass civilian deaths, every other species had eventually surrendered. Their people had turned against their own fighters, demanding that they stop the violence. The resistance had crumbled from within. Velthury expected the same thing to happen on Earth. Cathrall was transferred from the mountain depot to an occupation zone in a region called Ohio. His new assignment was to participate in the Decimation Protocol. He was ordered to help select and execute civilians in response to resistance attacks. He hated the assignment. He hated what he was being asked to do. But he was a soldier, and he followed orders. The first execution took place in a small town that had been the site of a resistance bombing. 12 Velthury soldiers had been killed when a truck filled with explosives was driven into their barracks. Under the protocol, 120 civilians would be selected for execution. Cathrall was part of the selection team. They went through the town's population records and chose their victims at random. Old and young, men and women, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers. None of them had anything to do with the bombing. That was the point. The punishment was meant to be indiscriminate. The civilians were gathered in the town's main square. They were forced to kneel in rows, facing a wall. Velthury soldiers stood behind them with weapons ready. The humans did not beg. They did not cry. They did not plead for mercy. They were silent. They looked at their executioners with eyes full of hatred and defiance. Some of them held hands with the person next to them. Some of them whispered prayers. Some of them just stared straight ahead, refusing to give the Velthury the satisfaction of seeing their fear. Cathrall remembered one man in particular. He was old, maybe 70 years in human age. His hair was white and his hands were weathered from years of hard work. His name was Henry Marsh, and he had been a farmer all his life. He had 3 grandchildren. He had never held a weapon. When the soldiers came to line him up for execution, Henry Marsh did not resist. He walked calmly to his place in the row. He knelt when he was told to kneel, but before the shooting started, he turned his head and looked at the crowd of humans who had been forced to watch. His voice was clear and strong. "Make them pay for every one of us," he said. "Every single one." Then he turned back to face the wall and waited for the bullet. Cathrall gave the order to fire. 120 people died in that square. Their bodies were left where they fell as a warning to others. The Velthury expected the surviving humans to turn on the resistance. They expected them to demand peace. They expected this cycle of violence to end. Instead, something else happened. That night, the resistance cell in Ohio launched the largest attack in the region's history. They struck the Velthury regional headquarters with overwhelming force. They used everything they had: guns, explosives, improvised weapons, and their own bare hands. They fought for 6 hours without stopping. When dawn came, more than 300 Velthury soldiers were dead. The headquarters was a burning ruin. The human fighters had taken heavy losses too, but they had won, The leader of the attack was a young woman named Amy Marsh. She was Henry Marsh's granddaughter. She had watched him die in the square, and she had decided to answer his final request. Reports came in from across the planet. Everywhere the decimation protocol was implemented, the same pattern emerged. Instead of breaking the human's will, the execution strengthened it. Recruitment for resistance forces tripled overnight. People who had been neutral or passive suddenly volunteered to fight. Farmers picked up guns. Teachers made bombs. Children carried messages for the fighters. The humans had a phrase for what was happening. They called it blood debt. Every civilian killed by the Velthari was a debt that had to be repaid, and the humans intended to collect that debt with interest. Catherall watched as the war changed around him. The Velthari had expected to crush the resistance with terror. Instead, they had given the humans a reason to fight that went beyond simple survival. Every execution created new enemies. Every massacre produced new fighters. The harder the Velthari pushed, the harder the humans pushed back. Something else changed too. The Velthari soldiers began to feel something they had never experienced before. They began to feel fear. Soldiers refused deployment orders. They claimed illness or injury to avoid being sent to combat zones. Officers requested transfers to other warfronts, anywhere that was not Earth. Morale collapsed. Discipline broke down. Catherall saw it in his own unit. His soldiers jumped at shadows. They could not sleep. They flinched at every sudden noise. They had nightmares about human faces, human voices, human hands coming out of the darkness to kill them. One night, Catherall was summoned to a meeting with his commanding officer. The officer looked exhausted. His scales were pale and his eyes were hollow. "I've received word from High Command," the officer said. "Admiral Tethfer has proposed a new strategy. He wants to bombard the planet from orbit, glass the entire surface, kill every human, and start over with a dead world." Catherall felt sick to his stomach. He thought of the millions of humans who had nothing to do with the fighting. The children, the elderly, the innocent. What did High Command say? He asked. The officer shook his head slowly. They refused. Not because they care about human lives. They want Earth's resources. They think they can still win this war if we just try harder. He laughed bitterly. They don't understand. This war is already lost. We lost it the moment we decided to use the decimation protocol. We thought we could break them with fear. Instead, we just gave them permission to hate us without limits. Catherall returned to his quarters that night and sat alone in the darkness. He thought about the old farmer who had looked death in the face and told his people to take revenge. He thought about the granddaughter who had answered that call. He thought about all the dead on both sides and all the death still to come. He understood something that night. The Velthari had made a mistake that could never be undone. They had turned the war from a conquest into something personal. Every human on Earth now had a personal reason to fight. A brother killed in an execution. A mother shot in a raid. A grandfather murdered in a town square. 8 billion humans. 8 billion personal grudges. 8 billion reasons to never stop fighting. Catherall had been taught that war was about strategy and resources and territory. The humans had taught him that war could be about something else entirely. It could be about hatred. It could be about revenge. It could be about making sure that even if you lost, your enemy would never truly win. The Velthari were about to learn that lesson in Blood in year 2 of the war. The humans launched their first major counteroffensive. They had spent the first year bleeding the Velthari slowly, grinding them down, wearing them out. Now they were ready to strike back, and Catherall would meet Danny Ortiz one final time. The Battle of Lake Erie would be remembered as the turning point of the war. The Velthari had fortified a position along the southern shore of the Great Lake, building a defensive line that they believed to be unbreakable. They had heavy weapons emplacements, armored vehicles, thousands of soldiers, and complete air superiority. They controlled the roads and the bridges. They monitored every approach with sensors and patrols. They thought they were safe. Catherall was stationed at a forward observation post when the attack came. It was the dead of winter. The temperature was far below freezing. The lake had frozen solid, a vast sheet of ice stretching to the horizon. The Valkyrie commanders had dismissed the ice as a natural barrier. No army could cross it in such conditions. The cold would kill any soldier before they reached the halfway point. The humans crossed the lake at night. They came on foot, carrying their weapons and equipment on their backs. They wore white camouflage that made them invisible against the snow and ice. They moved in silence, thousands of them, spreading across the frozen lake like ghosts. The first warning came from a sensor station that detected movement on the ice. The operator reported the contact, but his superiors dismissed it as an equipment malfunction. Nothing could be moving out there. It was impossible. An hour later, the humans reached the shore. Catherall heard the first shots from his observation post. Then the explosion started. The Valkyrie defensive line erupted in fire and chaos. The humans were everywhere, attacking from directions that should have been impossible. They moved through the freezing darkness as if the cold could not touch them. Catherall grabbed his weapon and ran toward the fighting. He gathered what soldiers he could find and tried to organize a defense. But the humans were already inside the perimeter. They were fighting hand-to-hand in the trenches and bunkers. The sophisticated Valkyrie weapons were useless at such close range that it was in one of those trenches that Catherall came face-to-face with Danny Ortiz. He recognized him immediately. Catherall had seen pictures of the man in intelligence briefings. He had heard stories about him for over a year. Ortiz was tall for a human, with dark hair streaked with gray and a scar running down the left side of his face. His eyes were calm and focused, the eyes of a man who had made peace with death long ago. They faced each other across the narrow trench. Around them, soldiers were fighting and dying. The sounds of battle filled the night. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They fought. Ortiz was faster than any human Catherall had ever encountered. He moved like water, flowing around Catherall's attacks and striking at openings that appeared for only a fraction of a second. He fought with a knife in one hand and a pistol in the other, switching between them seamlessly. Catherall was stronger. His Valkyrie body was built for combat. His scales provided natural armor. He used his size and power to push Ortiz back, trying to overwhelm him with brute force. They traded blows in the darkness. Catherall felt Ortiz's knife slice across his arm, cutting through his scales. He felt the impact of the human's pistol against his chest, the bullets punching through his armor. He swung his own blade and felt it bite into Ortiz's shoulder. The human grunted in pain but did not fall. He did not even slow down. Catherall swung again, trying to finish the fight. But Ortiz ducked under the blow and came up inside his guard. The human's knife found the joint between the plates on Catherall's arm, driving deep into the flesh beneath. Catherall screamed. He felt his arm go numb. He tried to keep fighting, but his body would not respond. Two Valkyrie soldiers appeared from somewhere and dragged him away from the trench. He tried to protest, tried to go back and finish the fight. But his strength was fading. He was losing too much blood. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was Danny Ortiz standing in the trench, his shoulder covered in blood, his knife still in his hand. The human watched him being dragged away. He did not follow. He did not try to finish the kill. He just stood there and watched. Catherall woke up in a medical facility behind the lines. He had lost his arm. The doctors said they had saved his life, but there was nothing they could do to restore the limb. The Battle of Lake Erie was over. The Valkyrie defensive line had been destroyed. The humans had won their first major victory of the war. 6 months later, the Velthari Dominion sued for peace. They abandoned Earth and all claims to human territory. They withdrew their fleets from the Sol system and agreed to pay reparations for the damage they had caused. The war that was supposed to last a few months had lasted 5 years. The Velthari had lost over 2 million soldiers. They had gained nothing. Kethral returned home a broken soldier. He spent years trying to forget what he had seen and done. He failed. The memories followed him every day of his life. 20 years after the war ended, diplomatic relations between the Velthari and humanity were finally established. As part of a cultural exchange program, a delegation of human veterans was invited to visit the Velthari homeworld. Danny Ortiz was among them. Kethral heard that his old enemy was coming. He thought about avoiding the meeting. He thought about pretending to be sick. In the end, he decided to face Ortiz one more time. They met in a garden at the diplomatic center. Ortiz was old now, his hair completely gray, his face lined with age. The scar on his face had faded, but was still visible. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir of some old wound. Kethral approached him slowly. His own body was failing. His scales were faded and cracked. His missing arm ached with phantom pain. They stood facing each other, two old soldiers who had once tried to kill each other. Ortiz spoke first. "I remember you," he said. "Lake Erie, the trench." Kethral nodded slowly. "I remember you too." There was a long silence. Then Ortiz extended his hand. Kethral looked at the offered hand with confusion. "Why would you show respect to someone who tried to kill you?" he asked. "Why would you offer peace to your enemy?" Ortiz smiled. It was a tired smile, full of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "Because the war's over," he said. "And you were just a soldier, same as me. The people who started it are the ones I'll never forgive. But you and me? We were just following orders and trying to survive." Kethral looked at the human's hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out with his remaining arm and took it. They shook hands in that garden, two old enemies making peace at last. Tiravine sat in silence as Kethral finished his story. The recording device had captured every word. Outside the window, the sun was setting on the Velthari homeworld, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. "What do you want future generations to learn from your story?" she finally asked. Kethral was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of everything he had seen. "Never invade Earth," he said. "Not because they will defeat you, though they will. Not because they will hurt you, though they will do that too. Invade them because you have calculated that the cost is worth the gain. And then watch as they make you pay a price you never imagined possible." He leaned forward in his chair, his old eyes burning with intensity. Humans don't do war the way other species do. For them, it is not about territory or resources. It is personal. Every human takes your invasion as a personal insult, and every single one of them will dedicate their lives to answering that insult. There were 8 billion of them. 8 billion personal grudges. We couldn't kill our way out of that arithmetic. He settled back in his chair and closed his eyes. Let them be. Let them have their world and their strange, fierce ways. They have earned the right to be left alone. Tiravine ended the interview and gathered her things. As she walked out of the veterans' facility, she passed a large window that looked out at the night sky. Among the countless stars, she could see a distant yellow sun. Somewhere out there, around that sun, the humans were living their lives, working and loving and building their civilization. And remembering, always remembering, the Velthari had learned their lesson. They would not forget, and neither would the humans.